I was a New Orleans Corps member, and in New Orleans, there are a lot of cultural traditions. There are a lot of really great things about New Orleans, from bounce music to the slang like Little Dip and Wazam, and words that I hadn't really come to know. So in my classroom, we didn't really pay attention to the New Orleans traditions. In my classroom, we didn't have class parties. Instead, we had kikis. And if you don't know, a kiki is a party, and you know the rest of the song. And if a student was telling gossip, I called that spilling tea. And if you had to stay for lunch, you didn't have a lunch detention. Instead, I kind of gave you a little RuPaul-esque Shantae, you stay. And you had to stay. And there was no such thing as a teacher stare, but a couple of times I did have to read a few kids, if you know what I mean. So one time there's this student, Evan, and he is painting gigantic purple butterflies on my walls in my classroom and blooming yellow flowers. And he turns to me and he says, "Mr. Fox, do I walk gay?" And so I turn to him because there's really no correct way to answer this. And frankly, walking gay was the least of his worries. And so I turned to him and I said, "What do you think?" And that was my out. I was like, answer a question with a question. That's always the way to do it. And so Evan then launched into this huge explanation about how when he got off the bus, his grandfather said that he knew Evan was gay because of the way that he walked. He walked gay when he got off the bus. Now, this wasn't a bad thing. Evan had come out to his mother, and his mother had taken him to his grandfather to say, look, Evan finally realized he was gay. And Evan told me stories of his coming out. Well, he painted murals on the walls of my room, and murals that I would say were rather over the top. And my room was a little bit over the top. Nobody cared what I did in my room. I had thousands of CDs that had gotten shipped to the New Orleans Teach for America office. And on one side of the CD, I had spray glued, if some of you have ever worked at Institute and know spray glue, colored paper, and then I printed out quotes about the achievement gap and put them on the back. And I did this over the course of 4 weekends because, frankly, I wanted them in my room. And I paid the custodian in beer and cigarettes to let me into the building. It was these little things that helped to create Room 1112. So this is my room. There are CDs hanging from the ceiling, and there are murals that make a Cirque du Soleil set look completely bland. And then there's me. And I am, for lack of a better word, the high school English teacher equivalent of a drag queen. I kind of insist on doing these like sassy Rihanna-esque readings like ZZ Packer and Sandra Cisneros. And then I also insist on performing the Donna Summer-esque classics of Pose and Washington Irving in American literature. And for me, my lessons were performances. And I think a lot of people resonate with that every lesson is a performance. And there was this saying when I started, I did Institute in Phoenix, and people said, if you don't have a plan for your students, they'll have a plan for you. And I learned that when I was doing drag in college. I don't look like most drag queens with this beard, but the first time I did drag, I was a freshman in college, and my wig, her name was Cheryl, because as every good drag queen knows, you name your wigs. So Cheryl fell off my head in the middle of a performance because I had not bobby pinned her down. And so I realized at a really early age that planning was at the root of everything. And so going into teaching, I didn't really plan for all the stuff that my students might find on the internet about me. And so it struck me as kind of weird, though, because 2 years in, even my students had not mastered the art of Googling me, and my name is not that common. So Jared Fox, you type it in, and it's the first image is this big sign that says, "I'm gay, but I'll be straight with you," I used for a student council. So I was a professional gay before I came to Teach for America. I lasted 4 months at my first high school before I was asked to leave. So I went to high school in Cleveland, Ohio, and I would carefully planned my walks home, so I was on the most popular streets so bullies wouldn't follow me. And I mapped out my bathroom breaks to be during the most popular time so that if one day it didn't stop at words, there were people there that might hear my screams. And for 4 months, I sort of lived with this omnipresent fear that either they, the bullies, would get me or that I would get myself. And my mother said it best in an essay she wrote some years back. My mother is an incredible writer who lives still in Cleveland, and she says this: "The ones that torment, they knew, and they used it against him. He was bullied daily. He came home and cried and begged me not to send him back there. I sent him to this school for the best education he could get. It was a private Jesuit all-boys school, the best in Cleveland, the school his brother graduated from. I busted my ass to pay for that school. All I could think of was, what if I sent him back there? Would I come home one day to find him swinging from a noose in the basement? Do you know how high the suicide rate is for gay kids? My son's life was never worth that risk." And so, thank you to my mother. And after 4 months, my mother let me transfer schools. And on the first day of public school, she cried hysterically. She said, "Out of the frying pan and into the fire." But what I did was I took that weapon, my sexuality, away from them. And I owned it. They had nothing to use against me because I owned who I was. And so I carried this pride into my classroom, into room 112. And it was a respectful place. And whether you noticed that I had a zebra print Scentsy, if any of you know what a Scentsy is, in the back of my room, or maybe you smelled the peppermint oil that I used because it was a naturally calming scent. Maybe you could tell that I used glitter gel pen to write the names of all my students in their book, one for at school and one for at home. There were a lot of things that I did that some might consider over the top, but it was because I was proud. I was proud of who I was, and I was proud of what I was doing. And one day, that came completely crashing. So I'm not going to get into the specifics. They aren't really important. It was second period. I was in the middle of a conversation about Henry David Thoreau, and Brandon called me a faggot. And he calmly and succinctly said, "You're a faggot," in the middle of a lesson. And that OT at the end, if any of you have ever been called that word, it kind of stinks. And it was clear as day, as everybody could hear. And I left the room and I came back, and I don't know exactly what I said. I do know that when I got home that night, there were a lot of voicemails from parents saying that they didn't care. And it was strange to me that they had to call and say, "I don't care who you are," but that it was the South, and that's the way things were. And it meant a lot to me. And so I went back to school the next day and I said, "I don't want Brandon to be suspended." And that was hard for me to come to that point. I actually wanted him to have an educational sanction and research the history of that word. And my principal told me that being gay was like practicing witchcraft. And that we would never make kids write a paper about witchcraft, even though I had earlier in the year. When we were doing the Salem witch trials, I had them write this whole paper. It was all about witchcraft, the whole thing, 4 pages, typed, double-spaced. But it was this idea that, like, she said witchcraft doesn't exist, and clearly some people still practice witchcraft, but she said it didn't exist, and for me, I'm like, so gay and lesbian people don't exist? And if you've ever seen True Blood, there's a scene where he says, "Gay people cook your food and wash your..." But it's like the Loch Ness Monster or something. Like, I don't exist. And I wanted him to write that essay not for me, but for students like Evan, who was there that day, who sat just 2 seats in front of Brandon, who knows that being gay is not like practicing witchcraft and that he isn't some mythical creature, who knows that being gay is not a phase and you can't just pray it away. Because if it was, a lot of people would have done that a long time ago. This is a difficult story because this is the story that kind of led me to get out of teaching. This was my last year of teaching, and it slammed me into a wall and it's a wall that I have only recently begun to step away from. I think back at my time in New Orleans, and I think that in the year 2012, in May when I left school, I could have been fired for being an openly gay man in New Orleans, Louisiana. That this world is hard, teaching is hard, life is hard, and that it doesn't just get better. That I have to make it better. And so in 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks, at this same time, I will get off a plane in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I will go to see my students graduate from high school. And I know I will cry. And the reason I will cry is some part of happiness and a lot of other parts of everything else. But when I cry, I'll know that I came and I did what I needed to do. That Evan will walk across that stage. I will give him a huge hug. And that day where Brandon called me that name will just be that day where Brandon called me that name. Thank you.